In 1991, James Whitaker and his pregnant wife Emily vanished from their campsite in Yellowstone. Rangers said they'd simply gotten lost. But 20 years later, a lone hiker stumbled into a hidden ravine and found their tent still standing, cookware rusted in the dirt, and a baby's blanket half buried beneath pine needles. Inside the collapsed canvas lay Emily's journal, its final entry scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Something's wrong. I think we're being watched." Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. The trail wasn't on any tourist map. By 2011, it had nearly vanished under pine needles and brush, just a faint groove in Yellowstone's vast backcountry. A lone backpacker, Ethan Cole, had taken it by accident, straying from the main route when his compass needle began to twitch strangely. The deeper he went, the quieter the park seemed. No bird song, no rustle of deer, just the crunch of his boots and his own breath, ragged in the dry summer air. After an hour of pushing through branches, he stumbled into a clearing and froze. There, wedged against a ravine wall, was the outline of a forgotten campsite. A tent, half collapsed, its canvas bleached to the color of bone. Pots and pans, rusted through, scattered in the dirt as though abandoned mid-meal. And beside the fire ring, a baby's knitted blanket, frayed but still soft to the touch. Ethan's flashlight beam swept across the tent flap. His throat tightened. Inside, a warped journal lay half buried under debris, its cover swollen with rain and time. With shaking fingers, he pried it open. Most of the pages were ruined, words blurred into stains, but on one, still legible, was Emily Whitaker's handwriting. It was steady at first, then jagged near the end. "Something's wrong. I think we're being watched." Ethan stumbled back, his heart pounding loud enough to drown the silence. The air felt heavy, charged, as though the forest itself had been holding its breath for 2 decades. He stuffed the journal into his pack, his hands trembling, and climbed out of the clearing without daring to look back. When he reached the ranger station and stammered his story, the officer on duty went pale. 2 names were murmured in disbelief: James and Emily Whitaker, the young couple who had vanished here in the summer of 1991, Emily 5 months pregnant at the time. For 20 years, Yellowstone had hidden their traces. Until now, James and Emily Whitaker weren't the kind of couple people expected to make headlines. In the spring of 1991, they were just another young pair trying to build a life. James, 28, worked as a mechanic at a family-owned garage on the outskirts of Denver. He was steady-handed, the kind of man who could take apart an engine blindfolded and still have bolts lined up neatly on the workbench. Emily, 25, was a schoolteacher. Her students adored her. She decorated her classroom walls with hand-drawn maps and little paper stars that carried motivational quotes. She was 5 months pregnant when summer rolled around, her hand always resting protectively on her stomach, like a habit she didn't even notice. Friends remembered how excited she was. "It'll be our last big adventure before the baby comes," she said over dinner one evening. James had been hesitant. Camping in Yellowstone was no small trip. It meant long drives, permits, and backcountry trails where cell towers didn't reach. But Emily persuaded him, reminding him how much he loved the outdoors, how memories were more valuable than anything else they could give their child. They planned it meticulously. James tuned up the car. Emily packed their gear with a teacher's neatness, everything labeled, folded, checked twice. At the baby shower that spring, guests laughed when Emily tucked a folded trail map between the tiny onesies and rattles. "The baby's first trip to Yellowstone," she joked. The morning they left, neighbors waved them off. James loaded the cooler. Emily climbed into the passenger seat with her journal balanced on her knees. The car pulled out into the street, the sun flashing on its windshield. No one knew it would be the last time anyone saw them alive. The Whitakers arrived in Yellowstone on June 18, 1991, after a 12-hour drive that left their cooler rattling with half-melted ice. The park was alive with summer, endless green pines, wide skies streaked with gold, and the smell of wood smoke drifting from distant campsites. At the entrance station, James leaned out of the window to show their permit. The ranger on duty later recalled Emily smiling as she rested her hand on her belly, joking, "We figured the baby should see Yellowstone before she does kindergarten." The ranger waved them through with a grin. They chose a site near the edge of the backcountry, not far from a shallow creek where elk sometimes drank. The tent went up quickly. James hammering stakes, Emily laying out their bedrolls with meticulous care. That first evening, they cooked a simple meal over the fire, pasta and canned sauce, steam curling into the night air. Neighbors remembered the sound of Emily humming, low and steady, while James fiddled with the lantern. Over the next 2 days, they settled into a rhythm: hikes in the morning, naps in the heat of the afternoon, campfires in the evening. Emily kept a journal, recording small things: the way marmots darted across the trail, how clear the stars looked at night, the baby's tiny kicks whenever she sat still too long. Her words painted the trip as idyllic, almost storybook. But even in those early pages, there were hints. She noted seeing the same hiker twice, a man in dark clothing lingering near a trailhead. James brushed it off, probably just another camper. She also mentioned the strange silence some nights, how the woods seemed to hold its breath once the fire died low. To other campers, the Whitakers seemed perfectly happy. They laughed, shared snacks, even posed for a photograph another couple snapped before heading home. In the image, James is smiling. Emily's hand rests gently over her stomach, and behind them the tree line looms, shadowed, watchful. It was the last known picture of them alive. The roll of film was developed weeks later, long after the Whitakers had been reported missing. It had been found inside James's camera, tucked into the tent when rangers first cleared the site. Most of the images were ordinary: snapshots of Yellowstone's wide valleys, geysers steaming into the sky, and Emily smiling in front of a waterfall with her hands resting on her stomach. But the last 3 photos were different. The first showed James crouched by the fire, his face half lit, half shadowed. He wasn't smiling. His eyes were locked just beyond the lens, as if distracted by something moving outside the frame. The second was blurry, taken in haste. The firelight streaked, and Emily's silhouette appeared at the edge of the tent, head turned sharply toward the darkness. She looked tense, caught mid-step, her hand clutching the tent flap. The third photo was the most haunting. The camera angled toward the tree line, unfocused, branches looming like claws. In the corner, faint but visible, was a pale shape, possibly a man's figure, shoulders hunched, head tilted. Investigators debated whether it was a trick of the light, but those who saw the print in person swore it wasn't just trees. Alongside the photos were eyewitness accounts. A pair of campers recalled seeing James and Emily the evening before they vanished, walking along the creek. Emily seemed uneasy, glancing over her shoulder often. Another family said they'd heard muffled voices outside their own tent around midnight, too low to make out words, followed by the crunch of boots moving off-trail. One ranger later admitted he'd passed their site during his patrol and found the lantern still burning at 1 a.m., something unusual for experienced campers. He chalked it up to forgetfulness at the time. Pieced together, the evidence painted an eerie picture. The Whitakers' last night wasn't peaceful. Something, or someone, was close enough to unsettle them, close enough to leave its trace in the final frames of a camera roll. The night of June 21, 1991, was unusually still in Yellowstone. Even the creek near the Whitakers' campsite ran quieter than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Other campers remembered seeing James and Emily by their fire just after dusk. They cooked a modest dinner, beans and cornbread from a cast-iron pan, and shared small talk with a family in the neighboring site. Emily laughed politely, but one mother later recalled how often she touched her belly, like she was grounding herself. James kept glancing toward the tree line, his brow drawn, though he never explained why. By 10 p.m., most of the campground had gone quiet. Lanterns flickered out one by one. But from the Whitakers' tent, light still glowed faintly. Several campers said they heard voices, James's low tone, Emily's softer reply, and then another sound. Not laughter, not arguing, just footsteps crunching in the pine needles, circling too close to the site. One teenage scout whispered later to his friend that he'd seen a man standing at the edge of the woods, a shadow against the firelight. His scoutmaster brushed it off, saying, "Probably another ranger." But when pressed, the boy swore the man wore no ranger hat, no uniform, just dark clothes, unmoving, watching. Around midnight, a sharp cry rang out, brief, cut off quickly. A woman in a cabin farther uphill stirred, half awake, but told herself it was an animal. Another camper swore he heard Emily's voice, muffled, followed by James saying something he couldn't catch. Then silence fell so deep it rattled. The next morning, the Whitakers' tent stood open, cooking gear half prepared, Emily's shoes neatly by the flap. But James and Emily were gone. No shouts, no goodbye, no trail leading out. Just the eerie stillness of a camp that looked abandoned in the middle of living. Dawn broke over Yellowstone with a thin gold light, but the Whitakers' site was strangely still. A neighboring family noticed first, steam rising faintly from the couple's fire ring, yet no one tending it. The tent flap sagged open, swaying in the breeze. At first, they assumed James and Emily had gone for an early hike, but when the hours ticked by with no return, unease grew. By mid-morning, rangers were called. Inside the tent, they found bedding rumpled as though left in haste. Emily's shoes sat neatly by the entrance, her jacket still folded at the foot of her sleeping bag. James's watch lay on the ground, its glass cracked, though it still ticked faintly. Breakfast had been half prepared, a pan on the grate, eggs uncooked beside it, a kettle balanced over dying coals. It didn't look like a couple setting off for a trek. It looked like a morning interrupted. A ranger crouched by the creek and studied the mud. 2 sets of prints led from the tent toward the water, but stopped abruptly at the gravel bank, as if swallowed by the earth. No drag marks, no signs of struggle, just absence. Word spread quickly through the campground. Parents pulled their children close, hushed conversations buzzing like hornets. "Pregnant, wasn't she?" one woman whispered. "She wouldn't just wander off," another man muttered. "Maybe a bear?" But his tone lacked conviction. The search began informally at first, campers calling out their names, voices echoing through the trees. By noon, more rangers arrived, boots and dogs combing the area. Still, nothing. Not a thread of clothing, not a scrap of food, not even a broken branch leading deeper into the forest. By nightfall, the site was taped off. Lanterns flickered as rangers sketched diagrams, radio chatter filling the silence. The Whitaker's car still sat in the lot, keys in the glove box, baby clothes folded neatly inside a duffel. Something had pulled James and Emily out of their camp, and whatever it was, it had left no trail behind. By the second day, Yellowstone had transformed into a hive of activity. Park rangers, county deputies, and dozens of volunteers fanned out from the Whitaker's empty tent. Maps were unfolded across hoods of trucks, red grease pencil lines circling valleys and trails. Dogs strained at their leashes, noses low, their handlers barking commands that echoed against the cliffs. Helicopters scoured the ridges, their blades chopping through the silence. From above, the backcountry looked endless, miles of pine forest stitched together, broken only by rivers and jagged rock. If James and Emily had gotten lost, they could be anywhere. But the first flights came back with nothing. No bright clothing, no signal fires, no movement at all. On the ground, searchers discovered details that didn't sit right. One ranger swore he found a boot print near the dry creek bed, but it didn't match James's size. It was larger, heavier, like someone else had been there. Another volunteer noticed how Emily's scarf had been snagged on brush 20 yards from camp, but there were no prints leading to it, as if it had been placed there after the fact. The contradictions piled up. Dogs caught a scent near the ravine, pulled hard toward a thicket, and then froze, whining, circling as though the trail had vanished. A deputy muttered that the ground felt too clean, like someone had swept it. His partner brushed him off. The forest covers its tracks quick. Back at the site, campers lingered, whispering behind their hands. 2 adults don't just disappear, one father said. Another shook his head. Not with her pregnant. She wouldn't stray far from camp. The search expanded 30 miles in every direction, yet each day ended the same. Exhausted men and women trudging back with nothing to show but scratches on their arms and dirt on their boots. By the 5th night, murmurs of doubt grew louder. Some blamed wildlife, others pointed to human hands. But no matter the theory, one thing was clear. The forest wasn't giving them back. By the end of the first week, the contradictions in the Whitaker search had piled high enough to choke belief. The official line from park authorities was simple. James and Emily had wandered off trail, gotten disoriented, and been claimed by Yellowstone's vastness. But anyone who'd stood near their campsite, anyone who had touched the details, knew the story didn't hold. Take the footprints. Rangers logged 2 sets heading toward the creek, but neither returned. Fine. But then whose print was it, pressed deeper into the mud, larger than James's boot, a full stride longer? When questioned, the lead officer shrugged it off as belonging to a search volunteer. Yet it had been logged the morning before search parties arrived. Or Emily's shoes, left neatly at the tent flap, laces untied. She had been cautious with her pregnancy, reluctant even to climb uneven trails. Would she really have stepped into the dark barefoot, in night clothes, leaving her shoes behind? Mothers at the ranger station shook their heads, whispering, no pregnant woman would. Even the dog's behavior rattled people. Twice they caught a scent trail strong enough to pull handlers into a sprint. Both times, the trail ended abruptly, in places where no tracks should have vanished so cleanly. Once at the base of a ravine, another in a meadow with short grass. The handlers exchanged uneasy looks but marked the logs blandly. Scent lost. Around campfires and cafeteria tables, whispers hardened. Someone was with them. They didn't walk out there alone. A volunteer muttered that he'd seen ranger paperwork shuffled, logs redacted. Another swore he heard two deputies arguing. One saying, "We can't put that in the report," the other hissing, "Then what do we tell the families?" The contradictions weren't just oversights, they felt deliberate, as though the case was being nudged, step by step, back toward the simplest answer: lost hikers, nothing more. But for those who had stood in that tent, seen the half-cooked breakfast and the baby blanket folded by the bedroll, the truth felt heavier. Too heavy to be explained away by chance. As days turned into weeks, Yellowstone seemed to divide itself between two camps: the official story of hikers lost to wilderness, and the stories whispered everywhere else. In the diners of West Yellowstone, in the line at gas stations, in the back rooms of ranger stations, the theories multiplied. Some swore it was wildlife. Grizzlies were thick that season, and a pregnant woman might not have outrun one. But rangers who walked the site shook their heads. No blood, no torn fabric, no drag marks. A bear doesn't clean up after itself, one muttered. Others leaned toward human danger. A lone camper claimed he'd seen a man in dark clothing near the Whitaker's trail the evening before they vanished. His report was dismissed as unreliable, but the rumor spread. Soon the mysterious figure was everywhere. In retellings, he wore a ranger hat or a hunter's jacket, or sometimes nothing more than shadows. At the grocery store in Gardner, two women debated in low voices. She was pregnant. He wouldn't let her just wander. Unless they argued. Maybe she panicked, but both fell silent when they noticed a ranger walking past. Still others pulled from Yellowstone's folklore. Old stories of people hearing footsteps at night, of figures spotted at tree lines, of cabins found stripped bare. One volunteer even told of a report filed in the late 80s about strange lights near the very ravine where Ethan would stumble upon the camp 20 years later. That report had vanished from archives. For the Whitaker families, the swirl of theories was torture. Each day brought a new version. James attacked Emily in rage. Emily wandered off delirious from pregnancy complications. A drifter lured them away. All of them painted the couple as reckless, unstable, or worse. None fitting the James and Emily their loved ones knew. And through it all, the Rangers' line never wavered. They strayed off. The park is vast. We may never know more. But the more the story was repeated, the more hollow it rang. Because if Yellowstone had simply swallowed them, why did so many details feel placed, erased, or rewritten? By the third week, the Park Service could feel the pressure mounting. Reporters had crowded the entrance gates, families were demanding updates, and tourists whispered uneasily about the pregnant woman who disappeared. Yellowstone's image as America's wild jewel was at risk of turning into a cautionary tale, so the official narrative was sealed. At a press conference outside the ranger station, the superintendent stood behind a wooden podium, notes trembling slightly in his hands. Cameras flashed as he spoke. After an exhaustive search, we believe James and Emily Whitaker tragically succumbed to the elements after becoming disoriented in the backcountry. Yellowstone is vast, rugged, and unforgiving. We extend our deepest condolences to the families. The words were practiced, polished, but they didn't land. Reporters asked about the footprints that didn't match, about the scarf found yards away with no trail leading to it, about the late-night voices other campers claimed to hear. Each time, the superintendent's answers circled the same point. There is no evidence of foul play. The park is dangerous. Cases like this are rare, but not unheard of. To the public, the statement gave closure. To the families, it felt like erasure. At the back of the crowd, Emily's sister was overheard whispering bitterly. They're blaming the woods so they don't have to blame themselves. Around town, skepticism festered. In a hardware store, two men leaned over the counter, speaking low. Lost hikers? Nah. He was a mechanic. She was 5 months pregnant. They weren't reckless. Then why stick to that story? Because it's easier. No headlines. No lawsuits. Still, the press moved on. Without new evidence, the story faded into the background hum of unsolved wilderness disappearances. Files were closed. Maps rolled up. Volunteers sent home. On paper, James and Emily had simply vanished into Yellowstone's immensity. But among those who knew them, the silence felt forced, like the truth had been folded neatly away, same as Emily's shoes left by the tent flap. The Whitakers families never bought the park's explanation. To them, the press conference sounded less like closure and more like a script. James's father, a stoic man who rarely spoke in public, told a local paper, "My boy wasn't careless. He fixed machines for a living. He paid attention. He didn't just get lost." Emily's mother was sharper, her grief spilling into fury. "She was pregnant," she snapped at reporters. "Do you think she'd wander off without her shoes? Without her coat? That's not my Emily." At community meetings back in Denver, the families handed out photocopies of Emily's smiling face, her hands resting on her belly. They told anyone who would listen that the couple was happy, prepared, cautious, not the kind of people to wander blindly into danger. Behind closed doors, frustration curdled. Emily's sister confided to a friend, "They're making it sound like she was irresponsible, like she put herself at risk. She was the most careful person I knew." That friend later admitted she didn't know how to respond. She just held her hand while the silence dragged on. The families petitioned the Park Service for more transparency. The search logs, the photographs, the ranger notes. Most requests were denied or delayed. What they received were redacted reports, pages blacked out in thick marker. By autumn, their voices were quieter in the headlines, but their anger hadn't dulled. To them, the Whitakers hadn't been swallowed by wilderness. They had been failed by people, and possibly by something far darker. After the headlines dimmed, Yellowstone moved on. Tourists returned, campgrounds filled, and the Whitakers became just another name in the park's long ledger of disappearances. For the families, though, time didn't dull. It calcified. James's parents kept his toolbox sealed, every wrench and socket left in the exact order he'd arranged them. Emily's childhood bedroom remained untouched, her diary stacked neatly on the dresser, baby clothes folded in a box at the foot of the bed. The nursery she had planned stayed painted soft yellow, crib still in its carton. On anniversaries, the families drove back to the park. They left flowers at the ranger station, pressed photographs into the hands of officials, and stood at the edge of the backcountry trail where James and Emily had last been seen. Tourists walked past without recognition, barely glancing at the grieving group. In Gardner and West Yellowstone, locals lowered their voices when the couple's names came up. Pregnant wife, shame. They say they wandered too far. But even in whispers, doubt lingered. A waitress confided to a coworker, "Lost hikers don't leave their tent like that. Something happened out there." The coworker only nodded, eyes flicking toward the forest. The official file collected dust in county storage, labeled closed, presumed deceased. But silence is not the same as peace. For 20 years, the Whitakers' absence was like an echo that refused to fade, an unfinished sentence left hanging in Yellowstone's vastness. Until the summer of 2011, when a lone backpacker took a wrong turn and stumbled into a ravine that time had tried to bury. The summer of 2011 was dry, the kind of season when Yellowstone streams thinned and old paths reappeared. That's when Ethan Cole, a 34-year-old backpacker from Montana, veered off his trail. He wasn't looking for anything unusual, just a shortcut to a ridge overlook. But after an hour of pushing through brush, he slipped down a slope into a shallow ravine. There, beneath a tangle of branches, he saw canvas. At first, he thought it was litter, an old tarp left behind. But as he pulled it free, a shape emerged, a collapsed tent, its poles snapped, fabric sun-bleached and torn. Nearby lay rusted cookware, a kettle fused with rust, and the faint outline of a long, cold fire ring. Half buried in dirt was something softer, a knitted baby blanket, edges frayed, still holding faint threads of blue. Ethan's pulse quickened. He stepped inside the sagging tent and froze. A journal rested beneath debris, its cover swollen from years of damp. He opened it gingerly. Pages had bled together, ink blurred into stains. But one entry stood clear, written in a neat hand that slanted into desperation. "Something's wrong. I think we're being watched." Ethan stuffed the book into his pack and scrambled out of the ravine, his heart pounding so loudly he swore it echoed off the trees. By the time he reached the ranger station, his hands shook as he handed over the journal. The ranger read the line twice, then looked up, pale. Two names surfaced again after 2 silent decades, James and Emily Whitaker. When archivists carefully dried and separated the journal's pages, Emily Whitaker's voice returned after 20 years. Her handwriting was steady at first, neat loops and teacher-like precision, but the later entries grew uneven. Words pressed so hard the pen tore the paper. Most of it read like a diary of a young couple camping. She wrote about how James teased her for overpacking, how the baby kicked during their hike to the falls, How beautiful the stars looked at night, how tiny the marmots were, how clear the stars looked at night. The baby's tiny kicks whenever she sat still too long. But midway through, a shift came. One entry noted, "We've seen the same man twice now, always near the trailheads." James says it's coincidence, but it feels wrong. Another, "Last night we heard footsteps outside the tent. Too heavy for elk, too slow to be animal." The final clear page carried the line Ethan had seen, "Something's wrong. I think we're being watched." Beneath it, faint but legible, was a half-finished sentence. James says, "Stay calm, but..." The ink trailed off, the rest blurred beyond recovery. Investigators laid the book on the evidence table, the words pulling the room into silence. For the Whitakers families, reading Emily's neat hand after 2 decades was like reopening a wound that never healed. Her mother whispered through tears. She knew something was out there. The diary shifted the case overnight. No longer could officials brush it off as hikers simply lost. Emily's words made it clear. Whatever happened, it wasn't just wilderness. The diary reframed everything. For 2 decades, officials had insisted James and Emily wandered into the wild on their own. But Emily's words painted a different picture. They weren't simply lost. They were being led, or at least lured. One entry described how James found cairns, small stacks of stones, marking a path off the main trail. At first, he assumed they were ranger markers, but Emily noted uneasily, "They weren't on the map. They led us deeper, not toward the trailhead." Another page mentioned a voice. James swears he heard someone call his name near the creek. "We followed, but no one was there." And then came the chilling observation. "It's like someone wants us off the path." "I don't like it." Investigators matched Emily's descriptions with ranger maps. The route she sketched in her notes didn't lead toward established campsites. It veered into a restricted geothermal zone, an area closed to visitors because of unstable ground and toxic vents. No official cairn should have been there. The first reveal was clear. The Whitakers hadn't drifted aimlessly into danger. They'd been drawn into it, whether by someone leaving false markers or by a presence in those woods that knew how to pull them off track. For the families, the realization was devastating. They didn't just disappear, James's sister said bitterly. They were pushed into it. The park's official story was cracking. But instead of accepting the new evidence, officials doubled down, pushing back harder than ever. When news of Emily's journal broke, it should have reignited the investigation. Instead, the Park Service and county officials leaned hard into denial. At a press briefing, a spokesperson acknowledged the discovery but was quick to frame it. Stress and exhaustion often cause misperceptions in wilderness environments. These writings, while tragic, reflect the couple's state of mind, not factual evidence of another party involved. Reporters pressed about the cairns, the mention of voices, the line, "We're being watched." The spokesperson repeated the phrase, "emotional distortion," until the words lost meaning. The families were furious. Emily's mother slammed her fist on a table during one meeting, shouting, she wasn't delirious. She was careful, pregnant, and scared. You can hear it in her words. James's father muttered darkly. They're protecting the park, not the truth. Even among rangers, unease spread. One admitted off record, "We've had reports like this before. People seeing figures, hearing names. Most never hit the log books." Another shrugged nervously. "If you write it down, they tell you to strike it." Bad for tourism. Whispers grew in town. In a cafe near Gardiner, 2 locals spoke low. They're burying it again, just like in '91. Yeah, because if the park's unsafe, they lose millions. But to those who read Emily's words, the pushback only made the diary feel more credible. The very fact officials were working so hard to discredit it made people wonder what they were afraid it might prove. The Whitakers hadn't been careless. They hadn't just wandered. Something, or someone, had led them off the map. It wasn't the officials who broke the silence. It was the old rangers. Men long retired, their pensions secure, who no longer feared reprimand. Over coffee in a diner outside Livingston, one admitted he'd read reports back in the late '80s that never made it into public files. A couple of hikers swore someone followed them near that ravine, he muttered, stirring his cup. Heavy boots behind them. Every time they stopped, the sound stopped. They turned, no one there. Another ranger, voice low, confessed he'd filed a log in 1989 about stone markers not on official maps. He'd marked their location, within half a mile of where the Whitakers' tent would later be found. A supervisor ordered him to remove the note, saying cairns didn't exist. The whispers spread. One ranger's widow recalled her husband waking from nightmares, mumbling about names being called in the dark. A former volunteer remembered a night in, quote, 90, when his search dog froze in the very same meadow where Emily's words hinted someone was watching. None of these accounts ever reached the official record, but together they painted a chilling pattern. The Whitakers weren't the first to feel watched, or to be lured from safe trails. They were just the ones who never came back. When these stories leaked, locals in Gardner started talking again. See? They knew, one shopkeeper said bitterly. They just didn't want tourists to know. Money talks louder than ghosts. For the families, the whispers were confirmation. Emily's journal hadn't been paranoia. It had been testimony. When investigators finally overlaid Emily's sketches onto old ranger maps, the path became undeniable. The cairns she described, the strange turns she noted, they aligned almost perfectly with a closed-off sector of Yellowstone, a geothermal zone riddled with unstable ground and toxic vents. No trails had ever been marked there for the public. The area had been sealed decades earlier, after a series of small collapses. Official maps labeled it simply as restricted. Yet the Whitakers' journal showed they'd been guided straight toward it. Hiking experts confirmed it. No one stumbles into that area by mistake, one said. You'd have to be led there. It's not obvious, not safe. Someone built a trail to make it look like the right way. The realization hit like a blow. James and Emily hadn't wandered. They'd been pulled into danger by false markers, someone deliberately stacking stone cairns to mimic ranger signs. Their trust in the trail had betrayed them. And it wasn't the first time. Buried in the archives, researchers found a 1987 report of 2 backpackers rescued near the same zone. They claimed they'd followed a marked trail that led them into unstable ground. That log had been shelved and never released. Locals shook their heads grimly when the revelation surfaced. In a bar outside Cody, a man muttered to his friend, "Someone wanted folks in there." "Or wanted them gone," the friend replied. The Whitakers' fate was no longer a mystery of wilderness. It was the chilling evidence of being led step by step into a place where survival was nearly impossible. The break came not from fresh evidence, but from a guilty conscience. In late 2012, a retired Yellowstone administrator sat for an interview with a regional paper. His hair was silver, his voice tired, but his words were sharp. "We were told to shut it down, protect the park first." He explained that back in 1991, the disappearance of a pregnant woman and her husband threatened to spiral into a scandal. Tourism was Yellowstone's lifeblood, millions of dollars tied to every season. The idea that visitors might be lured into restricted areas was unthinkable. Lawsuits would have been inevitable. So the orders came down. Label it lost hikers. Suppress reports about cairns. Scrub ranger logs that mentioned voices or figures. And make sure the families were nudged toward quiet grief. It wasn't about finding the truth, the administrator said flatly. It was about controlling the story. The admission burned through local communities. At a diner near Livingston, 2 old-timers debated it over black coffee. So they knew? They knew enough, and they left those kids to mourn 20 years for a lie. For the Whitakers' families, the confession felt like salt in an open wound. James's father said simply, "We were robbed twice. First of our children, then of the truth." Emily's mother wept in silence, clutching the returned journal, as if her daughter's words could finally speak louder than the officials who had buried them. The cover-up was no longer rumor. It was documented, admitted. Yellowstone had not just swallowed the Whitakers. It had hidden them. When the truth finally clawed its way into daylight, the Whitakers' families gathered in Denver for what felt less like closure and more like an unmasking. The journal had been returned to them, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, its pages still warped with age. Emily's handwriting, steady at first, jagged at the end, was passed from hand to trembling hand. James's sister broke down, reading the words aloud. "Something's wrong. I think we're being watched." Her voice cracked, and the room fell into a silence thick enough to choke. For 20 years they'd been told their loved ones had simply wandered. Now they held proof of something darker, that James and Emily had been led away, their trust weaponized against them. Neighbors stopped by with food, with quiet embraces, with apologies that felt years too late. One old friend admitted, "We thought you were chasing ghosts all this time." Turns out the ghosts were real. The families pushed for accountability, demanding the park release unredacted files. What they received was partial. Some logs still blacked out, others missing altogether. The cover-up ran deep, but at least now, the silence was broken. In interviews, James's father spoke calmly but firmly. We can't change what happened, but we can tell the truth, so the next family isn't told their children just got lost," Emily's mother added softly. She was careful. She was strong. And she knew something wasn't right. Don't let them forget her voice. The reckoning didn't heal the wound, but it stopped the bleeding lie. In the summer of 2013, Yellowstone officials quietly unveiled a plaque near the backcountry trailhead closest to where the Whitakers had camped. It was simple. Bronze fixed to a boulder, etched with their names, James and Emily Whitaker, and unborn child. Lost, but not forgotten. For some, it was a gesture long overdue. The families gathered, clutching each other's hands as the plaque was revealed. Emily's mother pressed her palm against the bronze, tears rolling down her cheeks. "At least now," she whispered, "she has a place here." But not everyone saw it as enough. The ceremony was brief, with no mention of the journal, the cairns, or the 20-year cover-up. Rangers read prepared remarks about the, quote, unforgiving beauty of Yellowstone, framing the Whitakers as victims of wilderness rather than of deceit. Afterward, murmurs rippled through the crowd. "They're still spinning it," one cousin said bitterly. A plaque isn't justice. Even among locals, debate lingered. In a bar that night, two men spoke low. "At least the families got something." Something? They got a stone while the truth still sits in blacked-out files. For tourists passing by, the plaque was just another marker among many. They snapped photos, paused for a moment, and moved on to Old Faithful. But for those who knew the story, it stood as both a tribute and a reminder of the silence that had smothered the truth for 2 decades. The memorial gave the Whitakers a place in Yellowstone's landscape, but it also reminded everyone how long it had taken for their names to be spoken out loud in the park they never came back from. Years later, long after the press conferences and the plaque, what lingered wasn't the official statements or the redacted files. It was Emily's voice, preserved on the page. Her neat, slanted handwriting carried across decades like a whisper frozen in time. "Something's wrong. I think we're being watched." Readers described the words as if they could feel her hand pressing harder on the pen, the fear that lived between each line. Those words became the heart of the case, the truest evidence of what happened in Yellowstone. Not a theory, not a cover story, just a young mother, 5 months pregnant, writing down her dread before she vanished into the dark. When hikers pass the memorial now, some pause longer than others. They don't just see names on a plaque. They imagine the tent half collapsed, the breakfast never cooked, the baby blanket folded neatly by the bedroll. They hear, in their minds, footsteps outside a canvas wall. The official record will always say, "lost hikers." But the echoes of Emily's diary, the cairns that led nowhere, the voices others claim to hear, those things leave a different story behind. And maybe that's the truth of Yellowstone. The park holds beauty and silence in equal measure. It gives back waterfalls, valleys, endless skies, but it also keeps secrets buried in its soil. So I'll leave you with this. When James and Emily stepped into that night, who or what was waiting just beyond the tree line? And that's the haunting story of James and Emily Whitaker, a young couple and their unborn child, silenced in Yellowstone's vast wilderness. But the question remains, who or what was watching them that night? Share your theories in the comments below. If this story pulled you in, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next case we uncover. And share this video with someone who loves true crime and unsolved mysteries, because the more we talk about these forgotten stories, the harder it becomes for them to fade into silence.